The prairie wind cut through the night like a cold blade, rattling loose boards and whispering secrets through the empty fields. Silas Blackwood had lived on this land long enough to know every sound it made, from the mournful howl of coyotes in the distance to the restless rustle of dry grass against the fence line. But tonight, something felt different. And it started with Jasper, his old marmalade cat. Jasper wasn't a creature easily spooked. Most nights, the cat claimed his usual spot on the porch rail, eyes half closed, tail flicking lazily at moths, drawn to the lantern light. But recently, Silas noticed Jasper abandoning the porch as soon as darkness fell. Night after night, the cat would stalk across the yard, sit stiff and silent before the old barn, and stare unblinking, like a sentinel, locked on some unseen threat. At first, Silas had brushed it off as some small animal nesting in the hay, or a wandering fox. But, as the days wore into weeks, Jasper's nightly vigil continued. Each evening, as the last colors of sunset drained from the sky, the cat would take his post, eyes fixed on the barn doors, as if waiting for something, or someone. Silas tried to shake the unease that crept up his spine each time he watched Jasper disappear into the shadows. The barn itself had been empty for months, save for a few rusted tools and forgotten tack. No cattle slept there anymore. No horses stamped and snorted in the stalls. Its walls were weathered gray, the roof patched in places where time had taken its toll. By day, it looked like nothing more than a tired relic of the past. But at night, under a thin sliver of moon, it seemed to brood, holding secrets behind its splintered boards. Silas wasn't a man easily given to superstition. His life had been forged by seasons of hard labor, loss, and the silent companionship of the land. In his 50s now, with weathered hands and a quiet stare, he had seen enough to know the prairie could be cruel, but rarely mysterious. Still, Jasper's behavior gnawed at him. Animals, he'd always believed, sensed things people overlooked. One evening, after finishing his supper, Silas decided to follow. He stepped out onto the porch, boots heavy on the worn boards, and watched as Jasper made his usual trek toward the barn. The cat's orange coat glowed faintly under the lantern light before dissolving into darkness. Silas set his coffee cup down, grabbed an old oil lantern from the hook, and lit it. The flame flickered against the glass, casting long shadows across the yard. He drew his coat tighter around him and started across the frozen ground, boots crunching against frostbitten earth. As he neared the barn, the air grew colder, sharper, almost as if the building itself exhaled winter. Jasper sat there, tail curled neatly around his paws, eyes locked on the narrow gap between the barn doors. He didn't move or look back at Silas, just kept that steady, eerie watch. Silas paused, lantern held chest high, the light dancing across the weathered boards. The cat's silence felt heavy, like the hush before a coming storm. Silas swallowed, his breath clouding in the cold air. "What do you see, old boy?" he murmured, voice gravelly from years without much conversation. Jasper didn't flick an ear, didn't blink. His gaze stayed fixed. Silas stepped closer, the lantern's glow pushing back the darkness. The barn door creaked as a breeze caught it, swinging slightly on rusted hinges. Beyond it, nothing but shadows and the smell of dry straw. But Silas's gut told him there was more. The cat wouldn't keep watch like this over a few mice. That night, Silas barely slept. He lay awake in the narrow bed, listening to the wind drag loose branches against the window and the faint, far-off yip of coyotes. But over it all, his thoughts kept circling back to Jasper's unbroken stare. He remembered the way the cat had always avoided conflict, how he had never wasted energy on things that didn't matter. If Jasper was afraid, it wasn't of nothing. By the next evening, Silas couldn't ignore it anymore. He waited until dusk painted the prairie in bruised purples and grays. As the first cold stars prickled the sky, he saw Jasper slip off the porch, as sure as the sun setting in the west. Silas pulled on his coat, took the lantern again, and followed. This time, he meant to look inside. The barn loomed darker than the night itself, its shape hulking and stubborn against the horizon. Silas paused, feeling a prickle crawl along his arms. Jasper sat by the door, posture rigid, as if bracing himself. The old man raised the lantern, its flame throwing shadows that danced and twisted across the rough ground. His boots crunched on scattered straw as he reached out and pushed the barn door open, with a long, low groan of protesting wood dot inside. The air smelled of cold earth and old hay. His lantern beam swept across empty stalls, spiderwebs glinting like silver thread. Dust motes swirled in the glow, floating slow as falling snow. Nothing moved. No sound except the dry rasp of his breath and the faint scratch of Jasper's claws on the wooden threshold. But then, in the farthest stall, something shifted so slight, so small, it could have been nothing more than the settling of straw. Silas froze, breath caught in his chest. He raised the lantern higher, trying to pierce the darkness that gathered thick around the edges of the barn. The shadows refused to give up their secrets, yet he felt it now, a presence. Something, or someone, was there, hiding just out of reach. His heart drummed in his chest, louder than the wind outside. The cat let out a low, uneasy growler sound Silas had never heard from Jasper before. The lantern flickered, the flame bending as if disturbed by a breath that wasn't his. Silas stepped forward, boots scuffing the straw, and peered into the stall. "Who's there?" he called out, voice rough with tension. But the barn swallowed his words, giving nothing back but silence. For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, from the darkness, came the faintest sound, a sigh, soft and trembling, like a secret forced into the cold night. Silas's hand tightened on the lantern handle, knuckles white against the iron. The cat crouched low, muscles tensed, eyes locked on that shadowed corner. Whatever lay hidden in the barn, it wasn't an animal, and Silas realized with a cold certainty that his life on this lonely prairie was about to change forever. Silas's breath caught in his chest as he stood staring into that dark corner of the barn, lantern trembling in his grip. For a moment, everything felt painfully still except the pounding of his heart in his ears. The soft sigh he'd heard still lingered in the air, as real and alive as the frost clinging to the barn's beams. Jasper edged closer, his orange fur bristling, every muscle ready to spring. Silas swallowed hard, took one slow step forward, and tried to steady the light. What he saw, at first, didn't make sense. There, huddled behind a mound of rotting hay, was a figure so small and thin it seemed to dissolve into the shadows. A pair of wide, terrified eyes reflected the lantern's flicker. Silas's chest tightened. It wasn't an animal. It was a child. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. His clothes were torn and caked with mud, his hair tangled and matted. He flinched when the light reached him, as though expecting a blow. Silas, caught between shock and instinct, raised his free hand gently. "Easy there, son," he whispered, his voice softer than it had been in years. "Ain't gonna hurt you." For a moment, the boy didn't speak. He just stared, breathing hard, as if weighing whether to run. Silas noticed how sharp his bones looked under skin that had known too little warmth and too little food. Jasper let out a low, questioning meow, and the boy's gaze flickered to the cat. Something in his face changed, a flicker of recognition, maybe even hope. "Where'd you come from?" Silas asked, stepping closer, careful not to frighten him further. The boy swallowed, his lips cracked and pale. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. I was hiding." "Hiding from what?" Silas pressed gently, though dread was already tightening in his gut. The boy's eyes darted to the barn door, then back again. "The man," he said, so quietly Silas almost missed it. "He'll find me." That single sentence weighed heavier than the cold. Silas felt a chill crawl up his spine, colder than any prairie wind. He knew these plains could be dangerous, but a child hiding in his barn spoke of something darker, story of fear that had driven the boy to seek shelter among broken boards and dust. They stood in silence, lantern light trembling against old walls. Silas felt an old ache he thought long buried stir inside him. Years ago, before the loneliness set in, he'd had a son not much older than this boy. But the fever took him, and then everything that felt solid slipped away. Seeing this child, afraid and half-starved, reopened wounds he'd spent years trying to ignore. "Come on," Silas finally said, his voice gentler than he remembered it could be. "Let's get you out of this cold." He offered his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, the boy's thin fingers closed around it. Silas led him back across the yard, Jasper padding behind them, silent as a shadow. Inside the farmhouse, warmth from the stove pushed against the night's chill. Silas set the lantern down and guided the boy to a wooden chair near the hearth. He poured water into a cup, added a pinch of sugar from the jar, and handed it over. The boy drank greedily, wincing as the cold water touched his cracked lips. "What's your name?" Silas asked, his voice low. The boy hesitated, staring into the cup as if afraid to answer. "Caleb," he finally whispered, double quotes. "Well, Caleb," Silas said, settling into the chair across from him. "Why don't you tell me about this man you're hiding from?" The boy's hands tightened around the cup, knuckles white. He took me, Caleb said, his voice trembling. From the road, said he'd make me help him. But I got away. His breath hitched, eyes shiny with unshed tears. I was scared he'd come back. I didn't know where else to go. Silas felt something old and fierce stir inside him. The kind of anger that burned slow and deep. You did right coming here, he said. Ain't nobody gonna hurt you while I'm around. The night grew deeper outside, wind rattling the windows. Jasper curled up near the boy's feet, and Caleb's shoulders seemed to ease just a little. But Silas knew it wasn't over. Whoever had frightened this boy enough to hide in a collapsing barn wouldn't give up easily. As the days passed, Silas tried to piece together Caleb's story. Bits and pieces slipped out of a man with rough hands and mean eyes, of nights spent running, and a promise whispered in terror that if he was ever found, there'd be punishment. Silas didn't know who this man was, but the thought of him prowling the plains turned his blood cold. One morning, Silas saddled his old horse, Dusty, and rode into town. At the sheriff's office, he told what little he knew. Sheriff Harper, a broad man with steel-gray hair, listened with a heavy frown. I've heard whispers, Harper admitted. Other folks say someone's been seen near the back roads. A drifter, maybe. Could be worse. Silas's jaw tightened. If he comes near my place, he said, voice low as a threat, I won't let him take the boy. That night, Silas kept the lantern burning longer than usual. Caleb, exhausted, slept on a makeshift bed near the stove. Silas sat in his chair, shotgun across his knees, eyes on the door. The prairie outside seemed to hold its breath. Darkness pressed close around the farmhouse walls. As the moon climbed higher, Jasper stirred. The cat lifted his head, ears pricking, staring once again toward the barn. Silas followed his gaze, every muscle tensing. Out past the window, a shape moved against the night, a figure, slow and deliberate. Slipping through shadows like water, Silas stood, the floorboards creaking under his boots. The boy shifted in his sleep, but didn't wake. Outside, the wind hissed against the siding, carrying the scent of cold earth and distant rain. He raised the shotgun, heart pounding in his chest, and stepped toward the door. In the darkness beyond the window, he thought he saw a flicker of pale light, a lantern, carried by someone who shouldn't be there. Silas pushed the door open, the prairie wind slapping his coat against his legs. Jasper shot out, low to the ground, tail flicking. The figure beyond the yard paused, turning slowly toward the house. Silas couldn't see his face, but the way he moved, calm and unhurried, sent a chill all the way to his bones. The night held its breath again, and Silas knew, without a doubt, that whatever evil had driven Caleb to hide had found its way back to his door. Silas's breath caught as the figure outside stepped closer. The dim lantern glow catching just enough to show the hard line of a jaw and the gleam of narrowed eyes. The wind seemed to hush, waiting. Jasper crouched low in the dirt, tail twitching like a live wire, ready to pounce or bolt. Silas raised the shotgun, though his hands felt heavy and cold. Don't come any closer, Silas warned, his voice low but carrying across the yard. The man paused, then tilted his head, studying the farmhouse like he was weighing something in his mind. In the shifting lantern light, Silas could see the torn coat, the grime on the man's face, and something mean and hollow in his stare. I just want the boy, the man rasped, voice sharp as dry grass. Ain't no need for anyone to get hurt. Silas felt his chest tighten, but he planted his boots firmer in the dirt. You're not taking him, he said, steady despite the fear clawing at his gut. Behind him, inside the farmhouse, Caleb's frightened face appeared at the window. Silas caught the boy's eyes and shook his head once. Slow and sure. The man's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. Old man, he said, stepping closer, you don't know what you're protecting. That boy's worth more trouble than you can imagine. I don't care, Silas shot back. He's just a child, and you won't lay a hand on him. For a moment, the world felt balanced on a knife edge. Then Jasper sprang forward, hissing and spitting, a flash of orange fur breaking the darkness. The man flinched, startled, and Silas stepped forward, pressing the shotgun barrel into the cold air between them. You take one more step, Silas warned, his voice like gravel, and I swear you'll regret it. The man froze, hate burning in his eyes. Then, slowly, he took a step back, the lantern shaking just a little in his grip. You're making a mistake, he spat, voice low and shaking. He's not what you think. Silas's jaw clenched. Maybe, he said, but he's still not yours to take. For a moment longer, The man stood there, breathing hard. Then he turned, his boots crunching the frosty ground, and melted back into the shadows, the lantern bobbing away until it disappeared behind the barn. Silas stayed where he was, shoulders locked, until he could no longer hear the man's footsteps over the wind. Only then did he lower the shotgun, the weight of it suddenly too much to hold. Caleb burst from the house, barefoot and shaking, eyes wide with terror. Silas knelt in the dirt, opening his arms, and the boy ran into them without hesitation. Jasper circled them both, tail twitching, like he'd chased the darkness off her. Good dot inside the farmhouse felt warmer than it had in years. Silas sat Caleb down and poured him a cup of water, hands still shaking just a little. "It's over now," Silas said, voice rough but gentle. "You're safe here." Over the next days, Sheriff Harper came by to search the property, but the man never came back. Slowly, Caleb's story came out in broken pieces. How the man had picked him up off the road, planning to force him to help steal from farms and ranches. Caleb had escaped one night when the man drank himself into a stupor, hiding until he found Silas's barn. The sheriff promised to keep watch, but Silas had already made up his mind. Caleb wasn't going anywhere. He patched up the spare room, brought out his late wife's quilt, and taught the boy to feed the horses and fix the fences. Jasper stayed close, never letting Caleb out of sight for long. As spring softened the frost, Caleb's shoulders slowly relaxed. His laugh returned soft at first, like something he barely remembered, but then stronger. One morning, Silas found him in the barn, talking to Jasper like the cat was an old friend. Silas paused at the door, listening to the boy's quiet voice, filled the space once haunted by fear. Silas realized the truth then. The boy had saved him too. For years, the ranch had felt too big and empty, the silence heavy as stone. Caleb brought life back, and in caring for him, Silas felt something mend inside that he hadn't known was still broken. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills, Caleb turned to him and asked softly, "Why'd you help me?" Silas looked at the boy, his chest tightening with quiet honesty. "Because everyone deserves someone to stand up for them," he said. "Even when they're scared, especially then." The words hung in the warm air, sinking in. Caleb nodded, understanding more than a child should. Jasper purred at their feet, the barn behind them now just a place to keep hay and tools, not secrets and fear. The ranch was still quiet most nights, but now it felt peaceful, not empty. And though Silas kept the lantern by the door and checked the yard before bed, he slept easier knowing they'd faced the dark together and sent it walking back into the night. In the end, what mattered wasn't who the man had been or what he'd wanted. It was that kindness and courage had turned fear away, and in that small farmhouse, two lost souls had found each other. And maybe, Silas thought as he watched Caleb chase Jasper across the yard, that was enough to light even the darkest nights.